Hello and welcome to Fatten, a podcast where we get into the thick of it. My name is Layla Cameron and I'm an academic, journalist, and artist. Most of my work revolves around body politics and fat liberation. This season, we're exploring what it's like to be fat in Vancouver, a place often referred to as Canada's thinnest city. I was 18 years old when I first came out as queer, and the hardest part of my coming out process was reconciling with the fact that I likely would not have biological children with my future partner. Eventually, I accepted that having children would look different for me, but as I got older and began to think more about having kids and what that would involve, I learned that there was an additional barrier that I hadn't thought of: my fat body. In Canada, there are BMI restrictions that limit who has access to fertility treatments such as in vitro fertilization, or what we commonly refer to as IVF. These restrictions are arbitrarily placed by the practitioners who run these clinics and effectively gatekeep who is allowed to have children based on the size of their body. I turned to the internet to learn more about this and eventually connected with Cailey Strauss. Cailey is a PhD candidate in her 30s who recently began to explore what fertility treatments would entail. And as you'll hear in this episode, she soon discovered that her path to parenthood wouldn't be that easy. To start off, can you just introduce yourself with your name as well as how you identify, including your pronouns or any other positionalities that you feel are relevant to this interview?
Sure. My name is Cailey Strauss. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a fat human.
Are you familiar with the fat spectrum? Like, is there other terminology?
Yeah. So, I mean, depending on the day, I am either a large super fat or a small infinifat.
Interesting. Can you talk a bit about sort of ebbing and flowing between those two categories?
Sure. Yeah. So one of my identities is that I am a woman who has polycystic ovaries, and because of that, my weight does whatever it wants when it wants. And so, like, if you had asked me a year ago, I was definitely squarely in the infinifat category, and now probably somewhere in the super fat category, but I don't own a scale. I haven't for years, and so I'm never really sure. I go by, like, how I fit in my car.
I think that's a really good approach to that.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard someone say that, but I really appreciate that. I appreciate both the acknowledgement of going between categories because it is a spectrum, but also how you measure that for yourself. I feel like I would probably do the same, come to think of it. Mm-hmm. My car is my safe place.
Me too.
I think for a lot of fat people it is.
That is a thing.
So you and I met online on a discussion thread about barriers that fat people experience when seeking out fertility treatments or fertility clinics. And there's a lot to unpack in this subject, and I'm really excited to speak with you about it. But before we start off, I'm curious if having children is something that you've always wanted to do, or if this was something that you were just beginning to explore the possibility of.
Oh, that's a great question. I spent a lot of years thinking I didn't want kids. And like, I was militantly against having kids. I thought, I'm just going to go get a PhD. This was like when I was 12. I'm going to get a PhD. I'm going to live alone. I'm going to move to a big city. And it turns out that's what I'm doing with my life. But okay, about 6 years ago, I had to have one of my ovaries removed because I had a huge cyst. One of those really like gnarly ones with teeth and hair and stuff. And something about that experience made me realize, well, wait a minute, I really do want a kid. One of the reasons I thought I hadn't wanted one was because I've always been mothering people my entire life. And I thought, okay, I do that enough with strangers. I don't need to actually be responsible for another human. But then that experience of potentially losing my ability to have kids made me realize that I really do want one. And I also started allowing myself to believe that I would be a good mother and that I deserved to be a mother. And so that has been one of my primary goals in the last few years, anyway.
I think that fat people very often take on mothering responsibilities in their friend groups, in their families, for a range of reasons. I mean, it took me a long time to realize that I had that role in my friend group, that because, and I do think it's because I'm fat, that I did a lot of emotional labor for everybody, that I was people's safe space. I was their therapist. I was their nurturer. And I do think that's in some ways because fat people are often desexualized. We're not seen as viable sexual partners, but we're seen as like the best friend, or we're seen as the mother. And I mean, obviously you can think about all of the different Hollywood movies where there's the fat best friend, but in our own lives, we are the fat best friend. You know, we are not the main character. And I think that is a lot to do with the fact that we prioritize other people's needs. We anticipate other people's needs before our own because we feel like we don't deserve them or something like that. And I appreciate that you noted that you moved to a space where you felt like you deserved to be a parent and that you wanted to be a parent and that you wanted to give yourself that you wanted to seek out if that was possible.
Yeah, for me, it was always really bound up in the desexualization of fatness. Because I grew up in a two-parent household, and there's a part of me who has always believed that because I'm fat, I would be alone forever. And even though I live far outside the box, and I've always kind of assumed that I would be a single mom if I was a mom, there was just something in my brain that said, no, if you don't find a partner, you aren't capable of mothering on your own. And I think that purely comes from like socialization and patriarchy, and all that stuff. And yeah, I think that the desexualization of fatness is a whole other topic that we could get into. But yes, we are definitely seen as the fat nurturing mother who somehow didn't have sex to become a mother.
Yeah, good point, actually. Can I ask you to elaborate a bit on your feelings of perhaps that if you were to be a parent, you were going to be a single parent? Is that something that was appealing to you, or did you feel like that wasn't going to be a choice?
Right. Both. So I'm not sure what came first, the chicken or the egg, but I am very stubbornly independent, and I don't like to have to involve anyone in my decisions. And so when I look at other single mothers that I know, they've all told me, yes, it's hard, it's overwhelming, but I got to make all the decisions. And that appeals to me. Unless I were to be so incredibly lucky and find someone who either let me make all the decisions or somehow agreed with me. And maybe it was self-preservation that I got really comfy with that idea early on, because the world likes to tell fat women that we won't find a partner or that we need to settle.
What has your experience been so far with fertility clinics in Vancouver?
Pretty awful. It never occurred to me that my body and how fat it is would be an issue. I was so naive. I thought this is just a really exciting adventure that I'm going to go on. And I went to a PCOS info night at Olive Fertility, which is one of the clinics here in Vancouver. And I was so excited. This was maybe 4 years ago now. And I'm pretty educated. I know a lot of things about the medical world and my own body. I've had enough stuff done to it that I can retain information. And so I went up to the doctor after the info night and I said, you mentioned that there was a BMI cutoff for IVF. What about IUI? And she didn't answer my question. She just said, well, you would have to consider bariatric surgery before we would pursue this with you. And I was shocked. I shouldn't have been, because doctors my whole life have pushed bariatric surgery down my throat. No pun intended. But it really, really threw me. And I said, that's not something I'm interested in. And she said, well, motherhood is about sacrifice. Don't you think this is a good opportunity to show how badly you want it and what you'll do for your future kid? And I left there in tears. I remember it was the day after my birthday, and I was already feeling old and infertile. And I just sat in my car and cried. And I thought, okay, surely this is a one-off. Like, doctors are not known for being fat accepting. I can accept that one fertility doctor in this city has this view. Maybe I got unlucky and I found her. And so I did some Googling, and I found an article about a doctor at a different fertility clinic who this article was about 8 years old, but he was defending fat women's rights to access fertility treatment. And I got very excited. I booked an appointment with my GP, who is lovely. And I said, this is the doctor I want to see. And she said, absolutely. I'm so sorry you had that other experience. Let's refer you to this guy. And so I got a referral to that man and was really excited. And in my first consult with him, he said, well, we need to get your weight under control. And I don't think I can even explain how defeated and deflated I felt, because I had done my research. I had gone above and beyond to Google who was going to accept my body. And he just kept saying, well, if you don't want to do gastric bypass, there's diets that we can put you on. There's medication we can give you. And so he put me on a medication that I had told him I didn't want, because it's hard on your GI tract. And he just said, oh, everyone says that. You'll get used to it. I didn't get used to it. And I stayed with that clinic for about 1.5 years. And for that entire 1.5 years, he told me that I just needed to be more motivated to lose weight. I explained to him that I had a history of disordered eating, that I wasn't interested in buying a scale, counting calories. His answer to that was, well, how about sugar? Would you count sugar? And I was running out of steam at that point. And I think that is the point at which I started complaining about it on Facebook.
I'm really sorry that you had those experiences. It's awful. That's really horrible.
Yeah. The part that made me angry was that the more it happened, I started believing it. You can't help but walk through the grocery store and go, should I be buying this? Should I be eating that? And I was mad because I've done so many years of work to not be that person. And living in Vancouver is a really fat-phobic experience. And I don't think I noticed it until I started pursuing fertility treatment. I was very ready to assume that I was imagining it. You know, that restaurant booths aren't really smaller here, but they absolutely are. Or that people don't stare at you more, but they definitely do. And I've now seen all 4 fertility clinics in this city. All of them have said that they won't help me unless I lose weight. Although one recently reached out to me and said that they are doing a study on fat fertility, and if I'm willing to be a participant, they might be able to help me.
So it's okay if you're a lab rat, but not
Exactly.
a person.
If I can get someone a publication, they might respect me enough to get me pregnant.
That's awful.
Mm-hmm. My worst experience was after I left that.
Sorry, it gets worse?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, just let me breathe for a second.
Thought I'd save the best for last. So after that guy, some of the medication he put me on made me bleed so heavily that I actually passed out, and ended up in the ER, and had a really lovely ER doctor who said, like, maybe this isn't the fertility doctor for you. And so the fertility doctor called me, and as I was about to break up with him, he said, by the way, I can't help you anymore unless you lose weight. Like, your body is never going to ovulate at this weight. And I asked him what crystal ball he had that would tell him that. And he said, I don't need one. I went to med school. And if I helped you at this weight, what would my colleagues think of me? And then it became clear that he was more interested in how his colleagues felt about him than the medical care he was giving. And so I asked to be referred to another clinic because I had reached out to their admin staff and gotten a really lovely response saying, we're sorry, that's been your experience. We, of course, will treat you as a whole person. Please get a referral here and we'll see you. So 9 months go by and I get an appointment with that clinic, and the doctor who meets with me virtually is just so rude. And she says, she asks is everyone in my family fat? And I say, well, on my mom's side, yes. And she said, well, I want you to go get genetic testing because this isn't normal. Like, the amount of fat that you are is not normal. There has to be something genetically wrong. And I mean, I err on the side of, okay, more information is better. But I said, what does this have to do with fertility? And she said, you won't ovulate at this weight. It's not going to happen. And again, I said, what crystal ball do you have? And she said, well, your weight is inhibiting you from ovulating. And I said, but all of my labs are normal. Everything's normal. Like, I know the science, I know the numbers. If I can prove that to you by doing all these tests again, will you help me? Like, if I can prove that I'm a healthy fat person. And she said, there's absolutely no such thing as a healthy fat person. And then it became clear that I wasn't dealing with someone who knew the research, because there absolutely are healthy fat people. And then I started seeing a naturopath. Her name is Dr. Gina Neonakis, and she works out of White Rock / Surrey. And when I sat in her office, she got tears in her eyes when I told her what I had been through. And I've been working with her for the past year and a half. And the last 2 months, I have ovulated and had periods on my own. And my weight has not changed. So I just want to put it out there that I was absolutely starting to buy into what these doctors were telling me, that I wouldn't ovulate at the weight that I am. And all it took was some supplements and some tweaking. I didn't have to buy a scale.
I feel like an issue that is related to some of the experiences you're describing is how the gatekeepers to fertility treatments also operate as part of a eugenics movement.
Absolutely.
Because those questions about, well, is anyone in your family fat? What is your family history? What will my colleagues think if I allow you to procreate? Are all insinuating that we are trying to work towards a future in which there are no fat people. So is this something that we can fix in you, or is this something that we should deny to you because we don't feel like you have that right? Mm-hmm. And it's awful.
It really is. The one guy that I saw, the fertility doctor, he, you know, in the middle of the ultrasound, he would pat my knee and say, "You're an educated woman, just get motivated to lose weight." And it was just so demeaning. Like, he was saying, "You're smart enough to know better." And meanwhile, I had friends who either had, you know, medical issues in the past or ongoing heart issues, and they were accessing fertility treatment without any barriers. In some cases, they were older than I was. And it felt like I wasn't good enough. And I walk around feeling like I'm not good enough all on my own. I don't need fertility doctors to tell me. And so it was an incredibly painful experience.
I'm like you. I like numbers. I like information. And I'm also doing a PhD. Mm-hmm. And my PhD is in reality television studies. Like, I love reality TV, and it's all I want to talk about. I look at representations of fat people in this genre, and that's just my jam. But in order to get people to listen to me talk about the thing that I am knowledgeable about and passionate about, I have essentially had to become a medical professional. And I would argue that I would probably pass, medical exams at this point, and I should probably be an MD. Because I have to dispel, using facts and speaking the language of doctors, all of these myths about fatness and all of these biases about fatness that influence research and influence the information that they are using to make these life-changing decisions for people, that is incorrect. Fat people do have children. They've been having children for a very long time. That fat people might not all have certain ailments, and even if they do, it might not be related to their fatness. That telling me to lose weight is statistically impossible. Yeah. So now what? Now what do you have to offer me? Sometimes what I say to doctors is, what would you tell a thin person with all of these symptoms? Mm-hmm. Because I'd like to try that. Yeah. And I'm curious what you do now to prepare for medical appointments. Do you go into them? Obviously, I think it's safe to say you probably go into them anticipating some form of discrimination. Yeah. So how do you prepare? Do you feel like you have to advocate for yourself, or is that something that is just too much labor at the moment? What do you do?
First, I want to agree wholeheartedly with what you just said. They are basically prescribing that we grow a tail. Like, it is that possible. If weight loss were achievable, the diet industry would have burned itself out by now. And we could spend hours talking about the experiences I've had with doctors. Several years ago, I saw an internist for a liver problem, and as he's measuring my body, he's sighing. And he says, "I don't know how you people let yourselves get like this." And luckily, I have a GP who is so supportive and lovely, and she personally apologizes every time this happens to me. But as for what I do, I don't want to say I've given up, but I have bought myself some time. I recently started seeing, I don't know what we're doing, someone who, doesn't feel like having a child with someone he just met. So I decided in January to get an IUD put in. And I was not willing to go to just anyone for that experience because I've had one before and it was awful. And so I had a friend who was late in a pregnancy, and she had a membrane sweep by an OBGYN that she thought was great. And so I went to this OBGYN, and I thought we had great rapport. It was going really well. And then at the appointment to get the IUD put in, she says to me, she walks in and she says, "Oh my God, you've lost weight. You look amazing." That's the first thing she says to me. I may have lost weight. I don't know. And then she puts it in. That was fine. And then as I'm getting dressed, she comes back in and she says, "I just want you to know that I'm so proud of you. And I hope that that now that you've lost a little bit of weight, if you just start moving more, the weight will just melt off." And we had an appointment a couple months ago about fat phobia and fertility treatment. And she said, "I think fertility doctors get preoccupied with your weight, and that's not right." And so that experience told me, okay, I did the right thing buying myself some time with an IUD because I am so burned out. I have had to face my fatness for 3-4 years now, and that is enough. I still want to be a mom. I'm 36 years old. I got my AMH tested, and it's great. So I still have several years to work with. But I've reached out to fertility clinics around the country, and so many of them are like, "We won't see you unless you lose weight." So, but then, ironically enough, the month before I got my IUD, I started ovulating on my own. So my hope is that when I am ready, I will be able to take this IUD out and ovulate on my own and not have these gatekeepers deciding what I can do with my uterus. Because you're right, fat people have babies. I have an ex who's still a good friend, and he grew up in a country in Africa. And he said, "Look, back home, when we want to get someone knocked up, we find a fat woman, and the population of our country suggests we're not wrong." And I thought that was a very sweet thing for him to say to make me feel better. Because in this white medical world, we are told that the only way to be healthy is to be thin, and that's not true.
I think, too, that when you were talking about how you thought you had good rapport with this doctor, that touches on a really important factor in this conversation, being that we put in a lot of work as fat people to have people respect us, especially people who have something that we need or we want. And I don't think that people understand how much work that is. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think about how I am very fortunate in the sense that I am an academic. I have access to research journals, and I've been able to arm myself with the tools and language that I know I need to gain someone's respect. Mm-hmm. And I think about folks who either don't have that capacity or those skills. And I often think of those folks when I'm in a space or in an appointment and the moment comes for me to advocate for myself because my doctor has said something fat phobic to me and I don't do it. Mm-hmm. I smile and nod. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a traitor, not just to myself, but to my community, because I have had so many doctors make assumptions about my lifestyle, about the foods I eat, about my health, about everything. And I have chosen to just sit there and take it because I just didn't have it in me to fight them. Or I was scared of being punished for fighting them on it or pushing back. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. If you don't feel like you can advocate for yourself, you will suffer. And especially if we're talking about medical settings or healthcare, that suffering can mean severe illness or death.
Yeah, and this might sound dramatic, but I would argue that doctors aren't that upset when fat people get really sick because they expect us to. They see us as these ticking time bombs, and our bodies will eventually kill us. And that, I'm very tired of that.
I remember learning about how fat people with a uterus are more likely to have like uterine cancers or cervical cancers. And people made assumptions that was because you were fat, when in actuality it's that fat people don't want to go to the doctor and be in such an incredibly vulnerable position when they're already vulnerable, that they are just less likely to be diagnosed at a time where then their condition can be treated or prevented. Yeah. And that breaks my heart.
Yeah, it is very sad. I luckily am rebellious enough that I will keep going to doctors because it's too bad that they don't want to deal with me, because they're going to keep dealing with me. And I have often remarked to friends and family that I feel very privileged to have the education I have, to have the ability to advocate for myself that I have. And when I think about how helpless I still feel, I can't imagine if I was from a lower socioeconomic bracket, if I wasn't white, if I was, less able to research these things on my own. Like you, I have access to journal articles that I have, unabashedly sent to doctors and asked why they're not up on the literature. I can't imagine fighting this fight with less privilege than I have. And even with my privilege, it's exhausting.
I have this idea of creating a brochure for fat people to just keep in their pocket, in their purse, in their backpack, whatever, that they can take out and just hand to a medical provider or to the receptionist as they're leaving, if they are afraid of confrontation, that has all of this type of information. And sometimes I've thought that seems a little silly, or I don't know if people would actually use it, but I think I'm going to do that because even if only a few people use it to advocate for themselves or to feel like they have that resource kit, that toolkit to push back a little bit, I don't know, I think my life would have been different.
I recently had a pretty bad experience with another internal medicine specialist. I don't know what it is about that specialty. I've yet to see one who doesn't hate that I'm fat. But after the bad experience, I decided to go back there and drop off a letter to him, and with point form notes of, I'm not going to see you again. I'm not willing to put myself through that. But if another fat person comes into your office, here are the things that you should maybe consider doing or not doing. I have no idea if he read it or threw it out or whatever, but made me feel better.
I'm proud of you for doing that. I'm proud of you.
I've always been pretty up on fat politics, and I don't know, maybe this sounds dumb, but it never occurred to me that this would be a problem. And it has been such a huge problem for the last several years of my life. And one of the worst parts of it was being blindsided. So if you are a fat woman or a fat uterus haver, rather, and you are listening to this and thinking about fertility treatment, please know that you are about to fight. I hope it goes better for you than it did for me. But please also know that you are not the first to have this problem, and you won't be the last. But there is a whole community of us fat folks who deserve to have children.
I was just about to say that. I was just about to say, for you, Cailey, as well as other people who want to become parents, that you deserve to have children and you deserve to have the life that you want in the body that you have right now.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
And it sounds like it's going to be possible for you, and I'm excited for you.
Yeah, it was. I've never been so happy to have a period.
That's fair. Yeah. That's fair. What can non-fat allies do to contribute to combating weight stigma in healthcare?
Oh, I wish we had another hour to talk about that. One of the worst things is when people dance around the issue, like when they're afraid to say the word fat, when they're afraid to, say, oh, is it okay if we talk about this? Much like how people dance around the issue of suicide or mental health too. When you talk about fat, you're not also talking about all the bad things that people think about fat people. Fat is literally just a part of your body. And so don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't ignore that your friend is fat.
That's my favorite thing when people say, you're not fat, you're pretty. And I'm like, I didn't say I wasn't. But thank you for telling me that you think fat people aren't.
Exactly.
So where can people learn more about you, or can they get in touch with you in some way? Most of the people I'm interviewing are, professionals in their industry, so they have websites, about their services or what have you. But if you do have space to connect with folks, how can people get in touch with you?
I actually have recently started an Instagram. So you can find me at Subversive Fatness on Instagram. That is my most public social media.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Cailey.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is produced and directed by me, Layla Cameron. Both audio and video versions of this podcast were edited by Ari Conrad Birch. Each interview was filmed and audio recorded by Rami McHale. Additional video was filmed and edited by Felix Naud and directed by ETW Media Productions. The music for this season is by the band Parlor Panther. Funding for this podcast is supported by TELUS STORYHIVE.